Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming along. I think the Cookie Monster and Elmo are my competition at the moment, so I feel really flattered that you've turned up. My children are much preferring to watch Elmo and the Cookie Monster at the moment, which I understand. My name's Linda and this is Luke, and we're from the Fair Work Ombudsman. We're the Commonwealth Government agency that's responsible for educating the community about workplace rights and also enforcing compliance with those rights as well. So if something's happening that shouldn't, we can conduct investigations into that, and in certain instances we'll also undertake litigation against people who've done the wrong thing as well. So what we'll be talking about today is some of the things which will be impacting on you if you're expecting a child or planning to adopt a child, or maybe going back bravely for number 2, 3 or what have you. We'll cover off the plans that you should be thinking about in a workplace context, and then also what's happening when you're away from work and some of the tips about keeping in touch with your workplace and negotiating your return to work if you're planning to go back into the workforce, and then also that chestnut of balancing your work and family, which having a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old I find is the easiest of it all. Okay, so we'll jump straight into it. Number one, what you can expect is absolutely to have fair treatment in the workplace. And I would love to think that all of you are being treated beautifully in the workplace, and by the vast majority of people have a really positive experience in the workplace when they're pregnant or their partner's pregnant, but sometimes things do go a little awry. So it's really useful to inform yourself about what your rights are in case something happens which is not right. You know what in fact you are entitled to. The first aspect will cover off safe job protections. For some people, when you're working, the job you were doing immediately before you're pregnant is no longer safe for medical reasons whilst you become pregnant. I had a friend who is a chemotherapy nurse, for example, and she had to tell her boss as soon as she was pregnant because she can't actually handle any of the drugs while she's pregnant, and she got moved into a different role in terms of doing rostering and some management of the staff. Some other positions we've come across could be, for example, flight attendants on airplanes who you're not meant to fly towards the latter stages of your pregnancy. So the Act actually provides you an entitlement that if your doctor says that you're fit for work, but it would be unsafe for you to do your normal job, your employer is actually obliged to transfer you to a safe job, so a job that you can do which won't impact your safety or that of your child while you're pregnant. If there's no safe job available at your workplace, you're entitled to stay at home and be paid by your employer. So we find in most instances, obviously, that if you do find yourself in that situation, your boss will find something valuable for you to do, obviously, rather than have you at home and pay you anyway. If you run into any problems in that scenario, don't hesitate to give us a call, and our contact details will be at the end. And Luke and some of our other staff are also at our stall, which is just in I-18 behind the first aid stall over there as well, and we'll be here all day to answer your questions. There's another type of leave which you're entitled to whilst you're pregnant, which is special maternity leave. If you suffer a pregnancy-related illness, for example, something like preeclampsia or the like, which means you need to head off on parental leave sooner than you otherwise would have, you're entitled to, as a minimum, an unpaid component of leave. You can, of course, use your personal leave if you have an illness related to your pregnancy that you can't actually go to work. If you do have personal leave up your sleeve, you're welcome to use that. But if it's exhausted, you're entitled to be away from the workplace and not lose your job. The one aspect to remember about that is any unpaid special maternity leave that you take comes off your unpaid parental leave entitlement. So if you had to finish up, for example, at say 30 weeks for a medical reason, you'd then be finishing up, say, maybe 6 weeks earlier than you would have planned. That would mean that of the 52 weeks that you're entitled to as a base, 6 weeks would come off that. So you'd have 52 weeks from the day you left work, be that heading off to have bubs or because you're too ill to attend work. And I will put the caveat on that what we're talking about today, the minimum entitlements, you're of course welcome to negotiate other arrangements with your workplaces. And if you have a positive relationship with your boss, you tend to find that you'll get looked after during this time as well. For those of you who are looking at adopting, you're also entitled to 2 days unpaid pre-adoption leave for attending some of the examinations and appointments that are involved in that process. Now, very importantly, pregnancy discrimination protections are quite clear in the legislation, and I hope all of you would assume that you're entitled to be treated no differently because either you're pregnant or your partner is pregnant. And when we're talking about partners, that of course extends to same-sex partnerships as well. It is quite clear that it's illegal to be discriminated on any basis because of pregnancy. We've actually undertaken a number of litigations against some employers who've done the wrong thing when staff have announced they're pregnant. We had one instance where a boss when the lady announced that she was pregnant, she was sacked. instantly because it was sort of too much trouble dealing with these sorts of issues, so we'll move you out of the workplace and get someone in. We took them to court and there was the court imposed fines on that employer. You might also come across people who have, a well-intentioned but perhaps misplaced need to protect you as well. If you don't hesitate to communicate really clearly with your boss, and if you need support from your doctor about what you are capable to do, sometimes people can become overprotective of you, and it's up to you and your medical practitioner to decide what you can and can't do. So if you have any problems in relation to that, or if you know of any friends or family who are experiencing issues about pregnancy discrimination, or having your hours cut, being given different roles, being overlooked for promotions which otherwise you think, objectively as you can, you would have been in the hunt for, don't hesitate to give us a call, because we'd be really keen to hear about that and help in any way that we can. Now, when it comes to the parental leave entitlements that you have, the ones we'll be talking about today are the base entitlements. Many organisations do provide paid parental leave entitlements which are more generous than these. But as a minimum, you're entitled to access 12 months of unpaid parental leave if you've had 12 months of service. And that includes casual employees as well. You just need to have worked for your boss on a regular basis for at least 12 months. You're entitled to request an additional 12 months at the end of the first year if you're deciding that you'd like to have some extra time off. The first 12 months you're entitled to without question. The second lot of 12 months, your boss can decline that on the basis of genuine operational reasons. There needs to be a genuine operational reason why they would say no to the second component. It is open to both parents, and as I said before, that extends to same-sex partnerships as well. One of my staff is actually due to have babies number 2 and 3 fairly shortly, so she's going to be quite busy, and what she and her partner are doing is she's taking 9 months of the leave and her partner's taking the other 3 months. So if you think of the 12 months as a family component, the parental leave is designed primarily to provide the primary care of the child, which means there'd be one person at home. The exception to that is the 3 weeks of concurrent leave, which is provided for in the legislation from around the time of the birth, where both parents can be on leave at the same time. For those of you who've already had a bubs, you know exactly why that provision is there. And for those of you who are having number 1, if you avail yourself of it, you'll understand at the end of the 3 weeks why that's such a good idea. In terms of some government support, the government now provides paid parental leave for 18 weeks at the national minimum wage, which at the moment is about $600. It's likely to go up in July by a little amount. And from the start of this year, dads and partners are also now entitled to 2 weeks paid at the national minimum wage as well. So, as I mentioned before, a number of employers provide funded schemes as well. So when you're planning your parental leave, it's a good idea obviously to find out, if you don't already know, what entitlements your workplace provides, because they don't cancel each other out. You can get the government funded one and a work one as well. And what a lot of people do is tend to combine it with things such as annual leave as well. In my own situation, I had an employer-funded one, and I took that at half pay, and I took most of my annual leave that I had up my sleeve at half pay as well. One tip I will give you, some gratuitous advice, is that if you do have leave up your sleeve and your circumstances do allow it, and sometimes that's not the reality, is that you can't do that, it's good to keep a little bit of your annual leave up your sleeve for when you go back. When you go back to work, you'll be adjusting to going back to the workplace after having whatever period of time off, and you'll be balancing a child with doing your job, which will be something that will be new to you. So if you can keep a little bit of your annual leave up your sleeve for a day of R&R, somewhere in there, you'll appreciate it at the time if it's at all possible. In terms of leave accruals, you don't actually accrue, if you're on unpaid leave, you don't accrue your annual leave and personal leave while you're on that. So if you're either on the unpaid leave of the 12 months or the government funded component, your annual leave and personal leave will not continue to build up. If you are on an employer-funded one, it will though. But one thing to remember is that your unpaid leave doesn't sever your length of service. So if you think of long service leave, for example, if you take 12 months out of the workforce unpaid, the service that you have before that leave still counts for when you go back. It'll just mean if you were at 8 years before you took your leave, for example, and you had 12 months off and you go back at your nominal 9 years, the clock for when you'd accrue your entitlements would go back to 8, if that makes sense. So if you're like me and you're kind of looking at those sorts of things, it's important to keep that in mind so you don't get too depressed when you click over the date and you're wondering, where's my long service leave? Giving notice, talk to your employer early. I'm going to talk about the formal requirements here. But as with all things about in the workplace in terms of flexibility, and particularly about parental leave, it's important to have conversations as early as you can. And I would strongly encourage you all that the first time you approach this issue with your boss, not to be when you slide a written notice across the table. You're much more likely to get a positive outcome in terms of what your personal needs are, in terms of flexible arrangements and your leave arrangements, if you're having a constructive conversation from really early on. As a minimum, you need to give at least 10 weeks written notice of when you want to go on maternity leave. So if you're planning on finishing up at around 6 weeks before Bubs is due, that would be at 24 weeks. Now, it's likely to be very evident by then, I would imagine, that you are in fact pregnant, so it's unlikely to be a surprise to them, but I would just really strongly advocate that don't let that be the first time you broach the topic with them. It's a bit hard at that point in time to guesstimate how much time you'd like to take, and circumstances can change both in terms of how you're feeling and also in terms of if you have a partner, your partner's arrangements as well. So you're required to also confirm your dates at least 4 weeks ahead. You also need to provide a medical certificate to prove that you're pregnant as well, in case there's any question about that. We've got a heap of checklists and templates and draft letters on our website that I'd encourage you all to have a look at. As I mentioned before, requests up to 12 months cannot be refused. If you want to stay at work closer than 6 weeks towards the birth of your child, most industrial instruments, and there are a couple of exceptions, but as a general rule, you'll need a medical certificate to work closer than 6 weeks. So if you're wanting to finish up, say, a month before, generally speaking, you'd be required to provide a medical certificate from your doctor to say that you're fit to work and then it's okay for you to work past that 6-week period. And if you don't provide that certificate when your employer requests it, they are entitled to make you leave the workforce. And there's some OH&S reasons behind that as well. So. Now, while you're away and you're on your 12 months holiday, relaxing and having all this time to yourself and getting lots of sleep, there are a couple of provisions which are provided to help you keep in touch with the workplace. The first is what we call keep in touch days, which means during the course of your parental leave, you're entitled to go into the workplace, if you choose, for up to 10 days, and it doesn't have to be 10 full days. You can do a half day here, a few hours here and there, over the course of your 12-month period of leave, to keep in touch. Now, you might be thinking, why would I want to do that? Some of the examples we've seen in practice include when new computer systems have been introduced at workplaces and everyone's getting trained on them at once. You might want to duck in and do the training. Depending on the work that you do, there's often annual planning days and you might not want to miss out on that. There might be a piece of work that down the track after a few months you think you'd be ready and able to do, but you don't want to give away your parental leave. The reason this is specified is in the past there was a little bit of a question that when you're on parental leave, if you went into the workplace and did some work about whether or not you're waiving the rest of your parental leave, which is now we have a wonderful government acronym of KIT, keeping in touch, is just so that people can take comfort that if you do some work in the course of your parental leave, you're still entitled to take the rest of it. As I mentioned before, you don't accrue annual and personal leave on unpaid leave components or government-funded leave components, but you can, of course, access your annual leave that you'd already accrued. And also, when you go back to work, if you had any leave up your sleeve, you don't say goodbye to that, of course. It's still there waiting for you as well. There is some flexibility around your commitments about how long you have your parental leave for. As I mentioned before, you've got the request to extend your parental leave by an additional 12 months, up to 24 months. And your employer is required to respond to your request within 21 days. Now, to access that right, you must put that request in writing, but as I said before, that shouldn't be the first time you have the conversation with your employer. I'd really encourage you, when you're thinking about those sorts of arrangements, to stand in the shoes of your employer or your boss and to think about it from their perspective. And if you think there might be operational reasons why your boss wouldn't be able to give you that second period of leave, try and think what those reasons might be and work through some solutions so that if you're going to your boss, you've actually got some ideas in place about, look, I've thought about it and I know what my job involves. Because I've been keeping in touch, I know what's happening in the workplace, and here's an idea about how I think it could work for you and me as well. Your employer is also required to consult with you on any changes that happen to your job, if there's any restructures or the like. And conversely, if you decide not to go back to work and you've given them notice that you're taking the 12 months parental leave when you've gone off rather than just resigning, you're required to give the normal amount of notice that you would give had you been working anyway. So if you decide not to go back and you're not extending your leave, you're required to give the notice that you'd otherwise be required to give. So just have a look at your contract of employment or your relevant award or agreement, and that will specify that in there. Now, when you return to work, you're entitled to come back to the same job and to the same pay. And if the same job is not available, you're entitled to a similar job both in terms of status and pay. And that's really quite important because if you were doing a job at a particular level, and so it's not just that you get paid the same amount of money, if that job's not available, you're entitled to any other job that's available of a similar status, which can be quite important for your career progression. Maintaining your salary is one thing, but if you end up taking a significant demotion but getting paid the same, you'd still be at a disadvantage in terms of your long-term career options. When you return to work, I'd encourage you, obviously, as I've said a number of times, to touch base with your employer before you return and keep in touch with colleagues to find out what's happening around about the place. If your employer has significant changes in the workplace and you are made redundant, you're entitled to receive that information in the same way that you would while you're actually in the workplace. So some of the key points about returning to work would be communicate clearly, stay connected, because that will put you in a better position to talk about some of the flexible arrangements I'm going to go through now as well. And there's a number of support agencies available, in addition to your family and friends, of course. We're available at the Fair Work Ombudsman, and places like your maternal health nurse are a good source for advice about transitioning back to work. In my own personal experience, I was really hesitant about going back to work after having my daughter. No one I knew had ever put their child in childcare, and I became convinced that my daughter would end up being a serial killer if she went into childcare. Thankfully, that hasn't panned out so far, but talking to other people really made a difference. And one comment that my maternal health nurse had said at the time was, the anticipation is always worse than the actual process of doing. So you'll be nervous about going back to work, you'll be nervous about managing it, but then when you actually do it, it's rarely as bad as you think it will be. So. In terms of balancing work and family, we'll move on to requesting flexible work arrangements. You have the legal right to request flexible work arrangements, and that could include changing from full-time to part-time work, working contracted hours, perhaps working from home as well, or job sharing. And you need to put that request in writing, and your employer is obliged to reply to that within 21 days. They can only refuse that on reasonable business grounds, but this is when it comes to the benefit of having that discussion beforehand, because if you can put your mind into your employer's perspective and think about what those reasonable business grounds might be before they get raised with you, if you do put in a request to, for example, to swap to part-time work, and your boss says, well, look, because of X, Y, and Z, I don't think that's going to work for us, you'll be in a much stronger position if you can say, well, actually, look, I've thought that through and I've come up with, these other ideas, and maybe it's job sharing, maybe it's, understanding your role. I could do this part of my role. I don't think I can do that part of my role anymore, but maybe this person over there would be good for that. And that links back into that communication and keeping in touch. You'll only be in a really good position to pitch, if you like, why your flexible arrangements will work for you and them if you have understood what's happened in the workplace. And that includes structural things, staff changes, and whatever's been happening in terms of the business. There's a whole range of good information on the internet around why flexible work arrangements are so beneficial for businesses in terms of increased productivity, increased engagement, reduced absenteeism, increased loyalty. So I'd encourage you, if you're a bit nervous about having that conversation with your boss and you suspect you might need to persuade them a bit about the benefits of it, I'd encourage you to take a look at some of that information, because you'll then be able to think about that in your own workplace context and talk about some of those things as well. I was quite fortunate working from the government. I never even had to have the conversation, can I please work part-time? It been entirely supported, but I know from friends in my mother's group that they've had really different experiences in that. And those who've come up against more challenges, those who've had a smoother path trying to negotiate that, have been those who've been better informed about what their rights are. You've got access to family-friendly policies and facilities, so find out what they are in your workplace. You might be pleasantly surprised, and if it's your first child, you might not just be aware of them as well, so don't always assume the worst. In terms of carers leave from when you go back, as a minimum, you can accrue up to 10 days paid leave a year, with the exception of casuals. and that accumulates from year to year. So if you're fortunate you don't need to use that in 1 year, you don't lose it, it's sitting there for you the next year. If you've exhausted your carer's leave and little kids pick up colds and all sorts of things, so sometimes those days can get eaten up pretty quickly, you're also entitled to 2 days of unpaid carer's leave for each occasion. So that's not 2 days per year. So if you've had a bit of a rough trot in your household with various illnesses or what have you, and you've used up your 10 days carer's leave and your little one gets sick again, you can actually take 2 days of unpaid leave and your boss can't say no to that. The final message I'll leave you with is just to expect fair treatment in the workplace. Don't make any concessions in terms of the fact that you're pregnant or you have a family. You've got a wonderful contribution to make in the workforce and to the community as well. So you should go into this expecting that, of course, I'll get treated the same as everybody else. And if you do come across any road bumps in the way, understanding what your rights are the best path to ensuring that you actually receive them. So we've got a heap of information on our website, and we're at the stand just over there in I-18 if you have any questions about that. And we've got a lot of examples of template letters and guides as well. So, all right, well, thanks very much for your time. If anyone has any questions, feel free to come up and see Luke or I, or pop across to the stand as well. Thanks very much.